Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for staying the course. We're going to keep it short and sweet. Okay, we're going to keep it short. I don't know about sweet, we'll see. So let me give it a few minutes for those in the room to kind of settle down. So my name is Akosua Adomako Ampofo, and we are myself, Carina, Jean, and Oduro. We are wrapping this up. And we really, in this session, are interested in getting some feedback from you. But before that, on behalf of all of us here, we'd like to say a huge, huge, huge big thanks to the Africa Institute, of course, to Satan, to Salma, who started the journey with us but has had to leave for another appointment, to Miriam, and to, where is Salah? Has he left? Where are you? Shout out to you, and of course, to our honorable president, who has made all this possible. It's always a pleasure meeting her and talking to her and hearing her thoughts and ideas and having this wonderful space and the imagination we're going to have for the new spaces. Okay. All right, so a few thoughts from me, and then the others will put their thoughts on the table, and then we'll hear from you guys. So for the period that we've been here, and for the March meetings, the tail end that I was able to participate in, tying all of that to notions of departure and return, and locating myself as a Ghanaian woman who predominantly lives in Ghana, born and raised in Ghana. So I'm coming to this from a particular place myself, right? Both physically, symbolically, identity, and all of that. So my reading comes from that place of privilege, and also from something that in recent times I have referred to as fromness. You know that question, where are you from? Where are you really from? That notion of fromness differs for us, and I think changes over our life course. So the past 3 days, issues of identity, the tensions around that, issues of belonging, who belongs, who doesn't belong, who's included, who's excluded, who decides, who asks the questions, have surfaced for me a lot listening to all of this. And the emphasis of location, it came out in very much, of course, in our conversation with the two architects, but the emphasis of location, both physical and ideological and conceptual. And the non-themes, some of the things that were kind of there but didn't surface that much, and I'm hoping that we will hear more of those from you, the themes that you were expecting but didn't quite surface. And for me, one of them was pain and loneliness, and the other one was the state, because the state looms very large, but we didn't really talk about the contemporary state. And who's going next?
I think I'm the last.
Oh, I guess it's on, yeah? Okay, cool. My head is spinning. I don't think I've recovered from jet lag. I haven't slept, but so I'm not going to say anything too deep. But I did feel like there were undercurrents that connected the panels together, but they were knotty and difficult, and they never sort of were able to surface. And especially just to echo Akosua, I think there was an undercurrent about race and place that if we were going to be here for a week or two, or for a lifetime, we might be able to interrogate things that really disrupt the kind of stable, anchored narrative of departure, return, etc., and which shift the story dramatically. And it all sort of came together for me today in the panels today that really featured artists. So I thought that was really interesting, the way that the non-artists among us couldn't find the words And yet, as we're listening about artistic practice and location and audience, etc., it all comes together. And that took me right back to Chika's presentation, right? Which, as I sat listening to it, and I think we all agreed it was just so brilliant, I said, well, but what does that have to do with like what we're talking about? And then today I'm thinking, it's exactly what we're talking about, because his metamorphosis is actually a metaphor, right? That shape-shifting is about race and location and time and change. It's packaged differently, but you can look at those pieces of art and the way they reconfigure themselves in different places and in different ways. So for me, that was going back to that keynote lecture. Started, I'm seeing this through line from the very first panel to this lovely concluding session.
So I think there was so much that was said and so many things to absorb, and I think sometimes we absorb the things that are, tend to be foremost in our minds. And for me, as somebody who for the last, 28 years of going back and forth between Ghana and the United States, has thought about race, the body, and blackness. Some of the things that really came out to me were the ways in which race and blackness both disappeared and then came forward when they did, how they did, the idea of coming to terms with, or being boxed in, I think Elizabeth used that phrase, to being black or African outside of Ghana, and not sort of having to confront that before, but then listening to Kwesi talk about these, the ways in which he himself has experienced these anti-black microaggressions from his peers inside of Ghana. So the reality that race is always there, and that the ways in which especially anti-blackness circulates, in all parts of the world, impacts how we understand ourselves and what it means to be black as we move through these different spaces. But I think one of the things that really popped out at me as I was listening to Tetua speak, and she was, sort of narrating this incredible story of this young Afro-Iraqi television journalist and her experiences of race and blackness in Iraq. And Tetua then mentioned how the time that she had spent in Colombia, she had encountered very similar kinds of representations, racist representations of blackness. And in that moment, it crystallized something for me about the ways in which Ali Missouri talks about sort of race and blackness through the notion of absorption in the Islamic world, and how people like Freire and Jose Vasconcelos in Latin America, through the idea of La Raza Comica or Lusotropicalism, are also thinking about similar ways of dealing with race through mixture, through absorption, but of course it doesn't do away with anti-black racism. And then I thought about the Africa Institute and where it's positioned and the possibilities that this place will have to bring the global black world into dialogue with one another. Because when I thought about it, I thought, I actually haven't ever thought about Missouri, like what a conversation between, Vasconcelos, or just putting their work together with somebody like Missouri, even though they're obviously talking about very similar things. And I think this is the place that those kinds of conversations are going to happen, and we're going to start bringing these things into a single analytic frame without papering over, the disjunctures either. And then the last thing I would just say was, and this is sort of pivoting towards July and towards Global Ghana in Search of Africa's Black Star, something that Jesse said about the new African, and the ways in which that vision didn't necessarily materialize, but yet at the same time, and I think Jesse was also saying this, just the idea of the new African, the fact that it's something that is constantly being remade. I mean, that was the gift of Nkrumah's vision, was that was that it's constantly renewable, right? And it can constantly be remade. And we're just in this kind of process, and we haven't yet maybe arrived there. And we won't ever, because it is something that's constantly being reconfigured and reimagined by different generations of Ghanaians as people move in and out of the sort of the nation state. So those are some of the ideas that I was thinking about.
Okay, so in regards to our panel, I think one thing that stood out for me, which I wish the other panels can speak to, deals with tapping into our creative reserves and coming out to the tangible output. So when I look into the panel of the panel that discussed reparation and restitution, etc., I'm hoping that they'll be able to exploit a certain level of creative reserves to be able to come up with tangible solutions to that. The other thing that emerges from watching John's film deals with a certain level of expression which cannot be captured in language, for example. So the enigmatic, right, that cannot be really captured in language. And how do you transcend that? And looking at these two things, I'm hoping that the other panel, other panels, right, can tap into it and perhaps talk more about that. So.
Just really quickly to reinforce something I think, Akosua, you said in terms of, like, as we throw it open to the audience, this idea of inviting all of you to, tell us what were the silences, what were the things that we didn't address that came up for you that you thought, we should be talking about that. We'd love to hear more about those as well. So we throw it open to you.
Thank you very much. It was 3 days of full of inspiration, and I learned a lot. One of the reflections that I have during the 3 days and listening to all the conversations and discussions was I saw a lot of returning. There was returning everywhere. So that returning is sometimes physical, sometimes it's spiritual, and sometimes it's ideological. All sorts of returning were being discussed. And even sometimes, as Carina, you mentioned about the umbilical cord in Fatih's choice, how the grass is green on the other side, and she have sacrificed so much to go on the other side, and then to return back to that internal voice. So very impressed, that there was a rich and a very rich discussion about returning. And I think that returning is not only bi-directional. That's why I say turn. It was just turning in different directions. Sometimes it's internal, sometimes it's in different directions. So, and then I connect that returning with search, continuous search for some sort of meaning, some sort of connections. So I really loved all the discussions and I learned a lot. So my question is, what has departed then? I didn't see so much of departure or departation and the spaces of that departure and departation. So maybe there isn't much, maybe there is a lot, and that could be a possibility or a conversation for another time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Should we take a couple? Yeah.
So I've got a question about the title, which may come a little bit late into the discussion, since it has been done, it has been beautifully done, the series. And it's about the claim to globality, which I ask because of at least two reasons. Does claiming global Ghana not conflict with other legitimate claims to globality that different parts of the continent may want to make? And I'm not saying it's because there is a global Ghana conference and thinking that would preclude other places from doing the same. But there is the fact that Ghana shares this history with other parts of the continent. And secondly, there seems to be a confluence of demands to think about globality from the continent, whether it's coming out of the decolonizing, thinking non-Western, and so on. So I think it's, for example, one of the latest journal that's been set up on the continent is called Global Africa, and in recent years I've also noticed that whether it's in international relations or in diaspora studies, there is a tendency to think globality as a posture that is meant to signal something about Africa that maybe so far was not the case. I don't know if the question makes sense.
Can I go? Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, it has been lovely, refreshing, inspiring. Like Bini said, I've learned a lot. I think apart from, this important, very productive engagements, artistic practices that we have witnessed and we have engaged with, some of the presentations, for instance, in the beginning of this conference, exhibitions and performances, I didn't hear the framing of, for instance, like in terms of engaging with ideas. Instead, another kind of narrative came in the beginning. And what does it tell us about scholarship, studies in Africa? And at the same time, there is this, going back to even Afrocentrism, discussing cultural aspects without by sucking the political and the economic out of the discussion, which caused some frustration in this auditorium. And this idea of locking the past, let's forget the past and let's go to the front, understanding time in its unilinear aspect, and those kinds of things. So what do these kinds of things tell us about studies in Africa? And what can we learn? And how can we also think about pedagogy? That is one thing. About the return, of course, there is this physical return, to Ghana and to the continent. I think Salah mentioned in the beginning, but it was not addressed, Edward Gleason's idea of return, When we live in the middle of these worlds, in the abyss, for instance, when the state building has crumbled, the post-colonial state and everyday life, dispossession, gentrification, even the idea of having home has become even an impossibility, in Ethiopia, this condominium has become the desire, and getting a condominium has become even an impossibility. So what does it mean to think about return from this kind of abyss? Thank you.
Can I just suggest one thing? I mean, obviously we're not gonna, the most important thing is for all of these questions to be, to answer each other and to engage. So I just want to say that I think we should hear each other out. People ought to respond, and that it's not this kind of unidirectional thing. So Naminata.
Thank you. So what I was hoping to hear more about is the question of ethnicity, because several papers have mentioned either Fanti or Yoruba or Igbo. So when we talk about return, And when we're talking about the post-colonial, there is the tendency to revert back to the nation state without taking necessarily into account the question of ethnicity. Because coming from the Ivory Coast, I don't identify as Ivorian. I identify as Malenke, even if I'm in the Ivory Coast, or even if I'm in Africa. So as people talk about the decolonial, which is supposedly going back to the indigenous, where is that indigeneity located? How do we think about authenticity outside of the ethnic nation? Of course, I am not trapping these ethnic practices within time. I am not denying them the possibility of change, but these ethnicities continue to remain an anchor of how we enter our scholarship. My scholarship is always defined in terms of my Malenkeness, not my Ivorianness, not my Africanness, but my Malenkeness. So my post-colonial, quote-unquote decolonial, always reverts back to that. So.
Thank you. I too have learned a great deal at this conference. I want just a play on the word return by putting a hyphen between the R-E and turn. One of the lessons that I have learned is how those that left or were forced to leave the continent for other places were compelled to turn in a particular direction, and then those that have come back to the continent are following the conventional return. But I'm also putting this in the context of the African knowledge system, of the cyclical nature of knowing and knowledge production, where turning and returning is what can give birth to new life. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. This has been, again, very exciting moments and conversations the past 3 days and before. And I want to talk about the second title, which is Sites of Departure and Sites of Return, from the perspective of generation and gender. And particularly, I'm interested in if I'm to replace global Ghana, not that I have an intention, but if we are to think of Pan-Africanism as generative term, for example, to think of it like Pan-Africa, for example, site of departure, site of return, through Ghana also, I wanted to see the critics, the internal critics of Pan-Africanism, but also the internal critics of Ghanaianism, if you want, which has been, has been going on intergenerationally until today, but also as that which reflects or kind of embraces the current generation. So how does the current generation relate, engage, or carves out a site of departure from Ghanaianness, whether it's global or local, but also from Pan-Africanist, broader Pan-Africanist. And I say this because of this example, because Nkrumah have been invoked multiple times in this conference, beautifully so, which I also relate. I always think in my head, it would be interesting to think of global Ghana and global Ethiopia together, right? So where Nkrumah and Haile Selassie meets and where they depart, and how the global order also kind of mediates their departure from each other, but also their meeting in a way. So after saying that, I'll go to the return. Again, return, if you see it from the feminist movements, which has happened within continental Africa, there is a lot of departure from the global, from the Pan-Africanist vision of Nkrumah himself, but which kind of gestures an important Pan-African intergenerational thinking that is required of us today. So there is a generational, but also a gendered departure which is needed from the previous Pan-Africanism, but there is something that we also embrace. So this kind of return and departure through Ghana, but also broader Pan-Africa, including the nation state, the overflow of histories, the overflow of violence, the overflow of political economy beyond the state, right? Which we now want to call it informal through the framings of World Bank or the other. But then, I mean, all of these complexities, but I want to focus from feminist movements which have critiqued, rightfully so, internal critique to Pan-Africanism and its masculinist gesture, which is very much also the case today, right? So what did we learn from those movements, and how did we re-embody this Pan-Africanism that we want to generally use today, whether it's through pedagogy, practice, everyday life? Thank you.
Jesse?
Thank you. First, let me just thank the four of you for an incredible set of 3 days. I just wanted to sort of ask you to reflect a little on the, I've been thinking a lot about the relationship of institutions and events like this, and I had the privilege of being here and being part of the March meeting and listening to those talks, and I'm thinking a lot about particularly the brilliant work of Lawrence and Khalil, the two exhibitions, both artists, but both are critical geographers and political thinkers, and thinking about so many people here who are practitioners and scholars. And when I asked Manifest how he wanted me to introduce him, it was like, well, what genre music do you do? Well, I don't know. How does this, how do we describe something? And I think this conference is a really good example of what I've been privileged to experience, what Sharjah Art Foundation and Africa Institute are doing here, which is kind of play with genres of institutions, like where institutions have become very anxious places where, economically speaking, it's hard to run things, where things fall between cracks. And I hear that with the conversation around architecture. What does it mean to build something when we're thinking about a system that works differently economically to imagine different futures? So I think that this conference is a nice example of how a space can be open to both artistic, expressive forms as well as scholarly forms. But I don't know, maybe we can reflect on how to push that further, because sometimes the scholars don't know how to talk artsiness, and the artists get pushed out by the scholarly language. And I think that you guys have had the courage to push that, and I think Sharjah Art Foundation in particular has done that. But I want to encourage us maybe to think even further about how to integrate those different kinds of forms of thinking through body, through images, through exhibitions, and then through the kinds of work that scholars do, talk stuff. And yeah.
I mean, it just strikes me, this isn't an answer, but it strikes me as a particularly germane moment to thank you, Jesse, for all of the incredible work that you did to make that happen, right? To make this seamless, to bring these different worlds together, and your insistence that, the performative and the creative aspects of the program had to be interwoven and integral to everything that we were doing, and not positioned as external to or an addition or kind of the entertainment, right? It's absolutely, so that was because of the work that you did with us, and so thank you very much. Other questions, comments, things that you want to say to one another? No, I mean,
I think there's a hand up there.
Thank you. I was hoping that maybe one of the four of you or someone in the audience could talk a little bit about the relationship between language and Ghana as a site of return, and what it might mean for someone from the diaspora living in Brazil or Paris or Mexico, or speaking Portuguese or other languages, and the point of entry that Ghana may or may not offer for someone who doesn't speak English, or the symbolic value of Ghana as a point of return, even if you are someone who is not from an Anglophone place in relation to the colonial history of Ghana, if that makes sense.
Thank you again. My question is, what action plan emerges from a conference like this? That's it.
Thank you very much, and I want to echo my gratitude for being invited and being able to present at this historic gathering of academics and activists and artists or cultural artists. And I think that one of the things that I noted, which perhaps maybe I was struggling, but I think now I could see how the panel spoke to each other. But I'm wondering if they would have spoken more intimately, if we had perhaps more intimate conversations, right? Like I felt like I'll just use this opportunity to be vulnerable for the moment. I felt extremely stressed about my presentation because I felt like, oh, this is a major plenary and I have to sort of, present in a particular way. And in retrospect, right, I feel like I didn't have to feel so stressed, right? Because I feel like it was, you all were curating something that was giving us the opportunity to have conversations across panels. So I'm not sure what I'm saying or, if what I'm saying makes any kind of, logical sense, but I'm wondering if those pieces that tied the panels together across space and time perhaps would have been more evident to those of us who weren't in the planning process if it was maybe there were more intimate conversations about sort of some of those pieces, because I know, like, for example, our panel, there was like 5, 7 hands up ready to kind of engage, and then unfortunately we ran out of time. So we weren't able to really have some of those intimate conversations. So I thought that was something that maybe I would have even pushed my work further or my thoughts about my work further. But I also just wanted to highlight this notion of incorporating cultural artists in the overall program. I thought was very innovative, and I think it's something that even helped to draw those linkages, right? Beyond what those of us who are academics perhaps were drawing, or helped tie a lot of things together. So I think that that's also something that I was very appreciative, and it made it a more exciting and fluid conversation or fluid sort of process. So thank you.
Yes.
I just wanted to say thank you for having this program, and to all the people that participated and spoke, and it really opened my brain on how to think of different ways, especially talking about the archaeology of knowledge and self. And it was something that I would have never have thought of if I had never come here before. So I just wanted to just say to everyone who has been kind to me, listened to me, and who has tolerated me, and just taught me everything today. So I just want to say thanks.
Thank you for welcoming us to your neighborhood.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you very much. When I want to make a comment. When the issue of when Ghana adopted the theme as a gateway to West Africa, I remember Nigeria coming up again also with the slogan, it will be the final destination of diasporans in Africa. And so I think that the return of diasporan Africans to Ghana or to Africa is going to spill over to other countries. And it's not only coming with people just to see the tourism attractions we have, but also to integrate. Many people as of now are getting in contact with people. Marriages are going on. We know adoptions are going on. We know people are getting into businesses. We know alliances are being created to make it a reality. And so since the concept was introduced in Ghana, I think it has spilled over to other countries, and particularly in West Africa. Senegal has come up with many programs. that has really seen the return of a lot of Africans in the diaspora. But again, not only people who were taken during the transatlantic slave trade, but also people who migrated willingly, particularly during the colonial times, and their descendants. Some of them may have stayed and probably passed on, but their descendants are also trying to trace their roots back to Ghana, and it's a big movement that is going on. And so this conference gives it an impetus that it's a reality that is happening, and we are living in history. Yeah, thank you.
I think there was a hand at you.
Thank you. Just came back again to ask, during the second part of the conversation, which is going to happen in Ghana, probably this is already planned, but it would be useful to invite probably people like Fatima or in Fati's Choice, so that one, just to recognize their work, but also I imagine the documentary captures only the tip of the iceberg, and there is more stories to be told, and there is more to learn from those who are experiencing the story. Just to add that, thank you.
I've got just a very small follow-up point, I guess, which is to maybe think about expanding the conversation beyond North America. Somebody mentioned Brazil, so to think about diasporic connection beyond the US, and to think also about diasporic settlement in West Africa. So there's a very strong Lebanese community in Ghana, and I think there might be discussions to be had around those type of connections as well. And yeah, we were just eating akara. This is a very small. We were eating akara the other day, and akara, which is the bean paste snack, which I think the name comes from Accra. In Brazil, it would be called akaraji. In Dakar, we call it akra. So I think these are very, very interesting things that might be worth looking into as well.
Mm.
I think go ahead.
I guess one thing that I've been thinking about, over the past couple of days is also around sort of the possibilities of pan-Africanism today and what that even looks like. I think a lot of the conversations we've had have raised that, like pan-Africanism, pan-Arabism, and thinking, about the Bandung moment and how it does not actually kind of translate today. But what are some forms in which, like, those kinds of solidarities, what will it take, or how can we think even of racial capitalism as one possibility to kind of reimagine what that kind of solidarity might look like? I mean, there was a lot of tension in the auditorium at one moment, but I think that it was also a very constructive moment to be able to think about what this idea of return and how we're focusing on the notion of return and departure in specific contexts, right? But how can a conversation across actually problematize that same idea of return? And this is linked, I think, also to Naminata's question about indigeneity and rootedness, and how actually that very concept then becomes deeply problematic when translated across. So I guess it's a question of translation, but also then the challenges actually of creating solidarity. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, Salah? Sure. Yeah. Yes, yes.
Oh, sorry.
I just wanted to say two really quick things, and I can't remember who actually made the comments exactly, but there was a comment about return, and there was a lot of focus on return. It might have been you, Binyam, but it struck me that we really emphasized return, and we didn't actually talk a whole lot about departure. And so I was sitting here thinking, why is that? And if this conference would have been in 1983, departure might have been a big, so there's something about the specificity, I think, of this moment that makes return. We heard a lot about return in the final session. There's something very specific about this moment where return sort of has greater precedence than departure. And so we might want to puzzle through that. As we're getting all these wonderful comments, it's a way to also think about the agenda. And then, Naminata, I really wanted to thank you because I was trying to think of where the silences, the undercurrents, the things that weren't addressed but sort of came to the surface and then they went back down. And ethnicity is one of them. And there was a question that was posed one of these days, which was about, Manchia and the Asante Kingdom and the sort of repression of memories of slaving and the slave trade. And, sort of stepping back and looking at Ghana, looking at the North, for example, vis-a-vis the South, who has the capacity to depart, who departed unwillingly. The country itself was not evenly impacted by the slave trade. And we did not disentangle that map at all. And when it emerged, at least in that question, it wasn't addressed. And so I think you're completely right, and I appreciate that comment, and it might be something that we take forward to Accra in July, so thank you.
I just want to piggyback on what Jean was saying about sort of the contemporary moment shaping the focus over the last 3 days on return rather than departure. And I think it's an interesting juxtaposition from the narrative that you would get if you're reading, newspapers or you're following news, right, which is absolutely about departure, right, and it is about the departure of folks from different parts of the continent across the Sahara. It's Fati's journey, right, and that's that's the story that you get if you're following contemporary news. So I also think it's interesting that in this conference, another narrative came forward, and it doesn't mean that we ought not pay more attention to this question of departure. And I think it was there in different ways, but certainly return was there in a more obvious way. And I think if we put those two things together, I think it says something interesting about the need for kinds of counter narratives, to what the dominant story that's being told about movement in and out of Africa in the mainstream media. And then the other thing I just wanted to say is, I think Mjiba, you mentioned this in terms of the context of like the form of the conference, and that's something that we've already begun thinking about how we might actually try something quite different in July, and not necessarily do kind of a conventional set of panels in order to create more opportunities for the conversation that clearly everybody wanted to have and keep having. And so, yes. And I think, yeah.
First, just to thank all the participants and the feedback that we've had more formally this afternoon, but throughout over the lunches and so on. And if I can read my handwriting by next week, I know that there's a harvest in here. I just want to say something about the what next, because an action plan, just because of, I guess, the way that my brain works, it's always like, okay, we're talking, it's nice, but what next and what we're going to do. And I suppose that for many of us who have gone through the system in Ghana, and by the system I mean school and work and dealing with the state, who inhabit several, I mean, we don't have the luxury when dealing with the state and you want to be an intellectual to decide where your leg is. So you're an activist and you're an academic and you're an intellectual and you're, you know, a practitioner. And then on top of all of that, things are tough, so you have 3 or 4 side hustles. So I really hope and I think that we will have very concrete things as well. I'm not sure what they will look like, but I'm sure there will be things that we can see and hold on to in terms of a moment, and we did this. They may be physical things like a book or a journal article or a play or a film or something like that, but I believe strongly that they will be there. I think, Pashington, it was you who asked that question. So this is my dream and my hope, and I, you know, from having known these guys here for a while, I know that we'll be definitely doing something like that.
Yeah, I mean, with me, I'm thinking in terms of the what next, right? I think something that we should really consolidate, it's what we've seen works here, which is combining artistic works, right, with, you know, these research presentations. And my hope is that we will try to do more of that in the next section. Mm-hmm.
For sure.
For sure.
Salah? Oh, yeah, okay, Salah.
Well, it's really just not a closing remark, but just to thank everyone who participated in making this happen, from the organizing committee to everyone else. But before I end, I just wanted to mention that whenever Afro-Arab relations are actually mentioned, there are 2 issues that always surface as central. One is, of course, the issue of race and slavery. And that was an issue actually in the 1976 conference was also tackled. And then the second issue that always surfaces is the Palestinian question. That's from the Arab side, because there was also, as you know, that is the evolution of the question, especially in the legal terms, in terms of the role of African countries. First, there was an era in the decolonization of total solidarity. Then there was the famous vote at the UN, where most African countries actually voted on the resolution of Zionism equal racism. Let's not forget that, with the exception of South Africa, because it was under apartheid, and perhaps Malawi and maybe Liberia, from my recollection. So to the answer on the practical level, I would like to say that when we're hoping, when we inaugurate the building in 2024, one of the ideas is actually, or a central idea, is to revisit the conference of 1976 on Afro-Arab relations. And mind you, that conference was attended by major African scholars, the Ali Mazrui, among many others, and from the Arab side, there was the Hisham Sharabi, Clovis Maqsoud, and many other people. They were young at the time, vibrant, and these 2 issues were debated because they were in the mind of the people, especially 76, it was after the October War, in which the Israeli managed to occupy vast land of Sinai Desert and many other places. So my comment is that when I think about my own situation, subjectively or objectively, being in Sudan is actually a blessing. Despite the doom, the gloom that we've experienced now with a military government after a great revolution, is that historically we have been at the crossroad. And there's something interesting about being at the crossroad of Arab and African. And the central question has always been in Sudan about Afro-Arabism and the relationship between the 2. At the intellectual level, of course, there are many people like the Khartoum School, the poet of the jungle and the desert, have always tried to articulate at the utopian level. As Sudan, there is a mixture of the 2, a hybrid, you know, a melting pot. That dream, of course, dashed with the partition of Sudan. There are, of course, foreign factors of intervention, but there are also internal dynamic in which the government couldn't manage diversity. The successive government, especially the military one, couldn't manage the diversity and couldn't see the beauty in diversity. But anyway, when this question is raised, of course, I wanted to share, I don't want to get into a discussion. Ahmed Sikenja, who presented as part of the Marshall, pointed to the fact that there is a lot of literature that was written in Arabic, that I think that's why we hope to play a role in translation. Because often scholars talk about that this issue is not mentioned in the Arab world, but actually there is literature. There are even movements. When you think about Mauritania, there's a Hur movement. If you think about early resistance, there was a Zanj revolution, or Sawrat al-Zanj in Iraq. And there is a continuous effort in terms of that. But it's also, it raises a very important question, which is what I think Nidhi alluded to, in terms of what is it that we want to learn when we think historically, like in the past, when we think about the history in the present context. What do we really want from those earlier solidarity movement? Is actually to reclaim the best out of them and to rethink issues that are important. So when the issue of the Palestinian comes, it's an issue of exile displacing others into exile. And that is central. So that's why when we talk about this movement of return, it is important to think of them in the context that that land is just a void. That land is a Palestinian land that is occupied, and that the policies of the Israeli state has been very problematic in terms of the whole narrative of return, whether the Israelites, whether the Rastafarians, among others. I thought these are all the issues that we hope to pick up in revisiting that era, which is thinking historically in the present. So thank you so much, and thanks to everybody, and I hope that's by way of intervening in the discussion earlier. So I snuck it. Okay. Thank you so much.